On March 14, 2004, around 12 p.m., Hawk at Rockin Raceway was operating normally. A group of 3 riders was loaded into the front row of the ride. The over-the-shoulder restraints were lowered and then checked by the operator. The group then expressed that they did not want to ride and they wanted to get off, but the operator refused as they claimed this was not possible until the ride cycle was complete. The ride's floor was lowered and the ride started. As the ride completed its first inversion at a height of about 60 feet or 18 meters, the rider seated on the outside seat slipped through their restraint and fell to the ground where they were killed. The ride was emergency stopped and the investigation into the accident began. The investigation into the accident was hindered by Tennessee not having any state ride inspections in place at the time of the accident. Accordingly, the investigation would be headed by the local police department. By pure chance, one of the officers in this department had worked as a ride inspector at a large amusement park previously, and they were able to organize a more thorough investigation. The ride was a prototype Zamperla traveling Hawk 24 model that found its way to a few trade shows before being sold to Rockin Raceway. It featured 24 seats with over-the-shoulder style restraints. Each of these restraints featured 3 different locks. The first and second were a pair of pins on the ends of the restraints that locked into notches on the side of the restraint. The third was a simple hydraulic device located behind the restraint itself. Each of these devices featured a sensor that communicated the position of the locking device back to the ride's control system. If any one of these was not secure on any restraint, the ride could not be started. Interviews with former employees of the park shed some light on the effectiveness of this system. Employees who had worked at the ride around the time it was installed in 1998 stated that the ride sometimes had issues with the restraint system, as the ride would read a restraint as not being secure when it actually was. This resulted in operators having to unlock all the restraints and then relock them repeatedly in an attempt to get the sensors to properly detect that all restraints were secure. This could occasionally lead to guests wanting to exit the ride or result in downtime if the restraints failed to register as secure. Since Rockin Raceway used a pay-per-ride model, any ride downtime resulted in lost revenue. The ride would operate like this for a while. Zamperla included a 2-year warranty with the ride, and accordingly they would service the ride a handful of times. With Rockin Raceway being a small park, only one person, the park's general manager, was fully trained on maintaining the rides at the park and received their training directly from Zamperla. The investigation found that the ride was set up by Zamperla at the park in 1998, and soon after Zamperla provided the park with a manual. This owner's manual was only available to the general manager, and there was never an operations manual given to the ride's operators. Ride operators were simply trained on how to operate the basic functions of the ride and then left to work it on their own. When problems occurred, they were to contact the general manager. The ride, being a prototype, experienced some issues. The first of these occurred in October of 1998, when the ride started moving without the loading platform lowering. Zamperla was called out to the ride and made some adjustments that included adding sensors to the ride's platform that would now detect the position of the platform and not allow it to start moving unless the platform was in the lowered position. This project required Zamperla to work in the ride's electrical cabinet, located at the backside of the ride. This electrical cabinet contained relays that connected to the ride's computer, known as a PLC. The PLC controlled every aspect of the ride, including the ride's safety system that disallowed the ride to start if a restraint was not read as secure. After this repair by Zamperla, the ride operated normally for the next few years. The investigation would uncover a previous incident that occurred on the Hawk on July 22, 2003, when a rider claimed that their restraint released while the ride was in motion. The rider claimed that as the ride inverted, their restraint popped out of the retaining holes at the base, and they were able to slip through the resulting opening. They claimed that they were able to hold themselves into the ride until it was stopped. The general manager was informed of this situation, but Zamperla was not, and the ride was allowed to reopen by the general manager. Interviews with employees that worked around the time of this incident, unlike those from earlier, don't mention issues with the restraints preventing the ride from starting. Just a few months later, the fatal accident would occur on the ride. Clearly, something had been done to the ride's restraints that meant they were no longer operating as designed. To figure out more, the investigation turned to look at the ride itself. Employees at Dollywood, a much larger park in the area, recommended a local engineer that the investigation team hired to look at the ride. The engineer would pore over every detail of the ride. This included testing every single seat sensor on every single seat. They were able to determine that every sensor was functioning as intended, but when the ride was turned on and the seats were intentionally left unsecured, the ride would not be prevented from being started. The engineer looked deeper by opening up the ride's electrical cabinet. Here they found something odd. A red jumper wire with alligator clips connected to two wires with their insulation stripped away. When the jumper wires were removed, the engineer found that the ride would fail to start with the restraints out of position. A Zamperla employee would later confirm that with the connection between wire 144 and 145 bridged, two of the wires that were jumpered, the entire seat sensor system on the ride would be bypassed. The ride's PLC would be being fed information that every restraint was secured properly all of the time, regardless of their actual restraint positions. With this uncovered, the investigation turned to who could have done this. This was fairly quickly narrowed down to two options. One was Zamperla, who had been working on the ride and had detailed knowledge of how the ride worked. The other was the park's general manager, who according to their own admission was the only other person who had the abilities and knowledge to modify the ride. Zamperla had last attended to the ride in July of 2000, when the park called them about an issue with the ride's motor. Zamperla came to the ride and authorized a temporary repair using a rubber tube that the park had on hand. This was done with the understanding that as soon as the proper part arrived, it would be installed. This repair did not have anything to do with the ride's electrical box, and Zamperla did not attend to the ride any time after this. Interviews from employees at around this time still seem to show that the ride continued having issues with restraints not reading as secure, even when they were secure. This would not be possible if the jumper wire was in place. Interviews with the Zamperla employees who inspected the ride after the accident also shed more light on how the ride was being taken care of. They found that on their visit after the accident, the same section of temporary rubber tubing was still installed over 4 years later, and the replacement part they had shipped was still sitting inside of its packaging. They also found a number of issues with the ride itself, such as the brake system being worn out and the restraint seat sensor lights attached to each seat not working or being missing altogether. All of this pointed to the general manager being the one who installed the jumper wires, likely in an attempt to keep the ride operating while avoiding the high maintenance costs the aging and complex ride was starting to demand. With this information uncovered, we can reconstruct the accident. On March 14, 2004, around 12:10 p.m., Hawk was operating normally, or at least as normally as it was capable of doing, as the ride was decaying after years of deferred maintenance. 3 riders were loaded into the front row of the ride. Shortly after, their restraints were lowered and then checked by the operator. The rider on the outside seat's restraint was not in the proper position, as the pins at the base of the restraint were not locked into the notches of the seat. The ride's control system did not detect this, as a jumper wire was in place telling the control system that all restraints were properly secured. The rider, for an unknown reason, requested to exit the ride, but was told that this was not possible until the ride cycle was complete. The ride was then started. The ride began by swinging back and forth. At this point, the people next to the rider in the outside seat noticed that the outside seat's restraint was moving significantly, as only the locking pin at the top of the restraint was engaged. The ride continued to speed up and began its first full inversion. As this happened, the rider on the outside seat slipped out of their unsecured restraint and fell to the ground, where they were killed instantly after falling about 60 feet or 18 meters. The ride operator noticed this and immediately emergency stopped the ride. This caused the pendulum arm to return to the loading position. However, as the ride was now e-stopped and without power, there was no way to unlock the remaining riders' restraints. The remaining riders sat on the ride looking on in horror as they waited for the general manager, who was the only person aware of how to unlock their restraints, to arrive to the park. After about 30 minutes, the general manager arrived and unlocked their restraints. The investigation would begin. In the end, the park's general manager would be convicted of manslaughter. Though they continued to deny that they had placed the jumper wire inside the ride's electrical cabinet, they admitted during the investigation that only them or Zamperla had the knowledge and ability to do it. They were also caught outright lying to the police investigators, at one point claiming that the ride would operate if just 2 of the 3 locking mechanisms were in place and the third was almost in place, likely in an attempt to cover for themselves if the investigators who were not knowledgeable about rides tried testing the ride system. Interviews with the park's owner, who generally did not get involved in the operation of the park, found that this general manager had come to them prior to the accident wanting to resign, as the maintenance tasks of their job were stressing them out and they were uncomfortable continuing. The owner convinced them to stay, but not long after, this accident occurred. With that kind of background, we can see that things are not always black and white, as it's easy to paint the general manager as a bad person. In reality, things are more complex, and a bad work environment mixed with factors like this manager's bonus being tied to how well the park did, which in turn was tied to how much the Hawk was operational, all contributed to their behavior. Though that's not to say that this person is blameless, as they ultimately put lives at risk and caused this accident. After this accident, they would exit the amusement industry. Rockin Raceway would quickly remove the Hawk, but Zamperla would continue to produce the ride and actually only recently ceased production in 2024. Several other Zamperla Hawk rides continue to exist and do so safely. All Hawks built after this one also featured a new restraint design that did not feature locking pins on the side of the seat. This has resulted in a more reliable ride overall. Rockin Raceway continues to operate, now under new management but under the same owners as 2004. The memories from this accident continue to linger on, and unfortunately, a similar accident to this occurred again in 2013, when a different flat ride had its safety system bypassed with jumper wires, resulting in a very similar accident. You can learn more about that in this video. As always, the links to my sources are in the description. As this accident was investigated by a police force, there was no official accident report prepared. Instead, the information for this video was compiled from the several lawsuits that were filed and featured interviews with those involved. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to read them, as there is some information that did not make it into this video. If you enjoy the factual and non-dramatic way that I cover these accidents, please consider liking and subscribing so that these videos appear above others in the YouTube algorithm. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.